Everyone thinks they understand what a paramedic really does. They picture sirens, quick saves, and a clean ending after the ambulance doors close. But ask the people who live this job every day, and the truth is heavier than anyone imagines. The calls that stay with them are the ones no one talks about. The ones that never tie up neatly. These are the stories they share only after the shift ends, when the uniform is folded and the city finally goes quiet. Listen to them speak for themselves.
I have worked as a paramedic for 9 years, long enough to know a shift can go wrong before you realize it has even begun. Every morning starts with the same steps. I unlock the rig, flip on the bright interior lights that make everything look colder, and start the checklist. I count vials, double-check expiration dates, tug straps on the stretcher, and tap each latch to make sure it clicks. That sound steadies me more than the coffee I drink on the way in. The station always smells like burnt toast someone forgot about and disinfectant that never truly leaves the air. I like the quiet just before sunrise, when the world feels paused. The first call that day came in as sick person, unknown status. That line is so vague it might as well be a blank page. We drove through narrow streets lined with recycling bins and cars parked too close to the corners. When we reached the apartment building, a woman waited at the entrance, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. She told us her father had been dizzy for hours. He insisted he would recover on his own, but when he tried to stand, he nearly collapsed. Inside the apartment, the air felt warm and heavy. The TV was playing a morning news show at a low volume. The man sat in a chair near the window with his head tilted back. I knelt in front of him and introduced myself. His skin felt cooler than it should. A thin line of sweat clung to his forehead. His pulse beat too fast and too light. He apologized for being a bother, a phrase I wish people would stop saying. Needing help is not a burden, but you cannot always convince them of that. We helped him stand, step by slow step, trying to keep him steady without making him feel fragile. His daughter hovered close, asking if he would be fine, asking if it was just dehydration, asking anything that might tether the moment to something normal. Halfway down the stairs, he paused and took a sharp breath. His hand trembled in mine. I felt the shift instantly. Moments like that happen silently and without drama, but you know something is slipping. In the ambulance, I placed monitors on him while my partner prepared the airway equipment. The smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of the engine filled the space. The man tried to form words but only managed faint breaths. His eyes darted around as if he were searching the room for someone familiar. His heart rhythm stuttered across the screen. I pushed meds and adjusted oxygen, hoping to buy time, hoping to steady him enough to reach the hospital with a margin to work with. Halfway there, his breathing grew thin, more air leaving than entering. His hand slipped from mine. My partner called out numbers while I tried to coax a rhythm out of a heart that did not want to cooperate. The monitor chirped at us in sharp bursts. We managed to regain a weak pulse, but it felt like holding something made of glass that was already cracking. At the hospital, the team moved quickly. The daughter arrived behind us, eyes wide, not sure where to stand or who to follow. We guided her to the hallway because we already knew the next part. The room filled with motion, commands, and the thrum of the ventilator. We watched from the doorway, doing nothing for the first time all morning. 20 minutes passed. Then the doctor stepped out, expression flat, voice low. He did not need to say much. The daughter folded into her hands, shoulders shaking, the kind of broken sobs you cannot soften with words. When she looked up, she thanked us. That part always lands wrong. It feels strange to be thanked when the outcome is the one you worked so hard to push away. Back in the ambulance, the stretcher sat empty. I stared at the straps for a moment before even thinking about writing the report. The radio crackled with a new assignment waiting for us. It always does. I took one slow breath, shut the doors, and signaled we were ready. Nothing about that call was unusual. It was a standard medical emergency, a routine response, exactly the kind of case that blends into the hundreds we see. but it stayed with me anyway. Maybe because the morning had started so calm. Maybe because his daughter kept trying to stay hopeful. Maybe because I could feel the moment he slipped, and I still could not stop it. Some days remind you that even the quiet calls can leave a weight you carry long after the shift ends.
I have been a paramedic for 5 years, long enough to know that calls rarely match the way they're dispatched, and long enough to ignore the tiny flash of hope that maybe a shift will stay calm. That evening the sky looked bruised, turning from purple to gray, and the air smelled like rain that never arrived. My partner joked that possible fainting usually meant somebody stood up too fast. I pretended to believe her, even though I knew better. We found him at a bus stop on the east side of town. A man in his mid-40s sat hunched forward with his backpack wedged between his feet. People kept their distance, staring but not stepping in. The overhead lights flickered, making everything look a shade too pale. When I approached, he raised his head just enough for me to see how unfocused his eyes were. I introduced myself and asked his name. His answer came out in a slow slur that did not match alcohol or drugs. His hands trembled as if he were trying to hide how scared he was. The bus shelter smelled like warm asphalt and diesel exhaust, and the hum of traffic behind us made the moment feel thinner than it should have. I checked his pulse. It fluttered like it was tripping over itself. He said he felt just a little off, but the way he gripped the edge of the bench told me he was fighting more than he admitted. A woman who had been standing nearby stepped closer and told me she thought he might faint again. That word, again, made the hair on my arms rise. We helped him stand. He apologized for being a mess, which made me want to tell him to stop wasting energy on politeness. His legs buckled for a second before we caught him. On the way to the ambulance, he kept murmuring that he didn't want to be any trouble. People always say that when they already know something is wrong. Inside the rig, I placed the monitor leads on him. Sweat beaded on his temple. He stared at the ceiling like he was following a moving light I could not see. His heart rhythm looked chaotic, erratic spikes with shaky pauses in between. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told him he was safe with us. He nodded barely. Halfway to the hospital, he asked if he could tell his daughter something. His voice cracked on the word daughter. I asked what he wanted her to know, but the sentence dissolved before he finished it. That was the moment the shift happened, the quiet kind, where a person feels something slipping inside them even before the monitor reveals it. His breathing tightened. The pulse on the screen suddenly dipped, then surged, then dipped again. I measured blood pressure twice, neither number looking anywhere close to normal. My partner adjusted the oxygen while I pushed meds, hoping to slow the storm building inside his chest. He tried to sit up as if fighting the drop, but his body betrayed him. His eyes lost focus and slid sideways. I called his name louder than I meant to. His fingers twitched, reaching for something he could not hold on to. The monitor sounded its harsh alarm, an ugly tone that fills the space and leaves no room for doubt. We alerted the hospital, asking for immediate intervention on arrival. There was no time to think, only time to act, and even that felt too slow. He sagged against the stretcher, not quite unconscious but far from aware. I kept talking to him, telling him we were almost there, telling him to stay with me, telling him anything that might reach whatever part of him was still listening. The ER team met us at the bay doors. They took him quickly, voices overlapping in clipped commands. I stepped back, gloves damp, arms tense, trying to stay out of their path. My partner and I exchanged a look we both understood too well, the kind that comes when you know you have delivered someone at the last possible moment, but probably not early enough. After we finished the report, I went to find out what happened. A nurse I knew pulled me aside. She spoke quietly, the way people do when they are trying to keep the weight of the words contained. He had a massive internal bleed. Nobody could have seen it from the outside. They were still trying, but the odds were not good. When she said the word unlikely, I felt something in my chest shift. We walked back to the rig in silence. The bus stop was only a few miles away, but it felt like another world. I kept thinking about how he tried to hold himself upright, how he apologized for being trouble, how he tried to tell his daughter something before he ran out of time. People imagine bravery as loud and bold. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting alone at a bus stop, trying to stay conscious long enough to finish one sentence that matters. And sometimes you carry those unfinished sentences with you long after the shift ends.
I have worked as a paramedic for almost 10 years, and in that time I learned a rule nobody writes down. Every new medic hears it eventually, not in training, but whispered during a slow moment between calls. The rule is simple: beware the quiet scenes. The ones without chaos. The ones that look harmless. They are the ones that pull something out of you and never give it back. It was a cold morning when we were dispatched to a wellness check. Those always make me uneasy. They sound gentle, but they are usually anything but. A neighbor had not seen an older man in 2 days and thought something felt off. That phrase caught my attention more than the call itself. When we arrived, frost lined the mailbox. The curtains were shut tight even though morning light was breaking through the trees. I knocked. No answer. The neighbor hovered behind us, arms crossed like she was bracing for bad news. She said he always opened the door by 7. It was already past 9. We got the spare key she kept for emergencies, and the moment I opened the door I felt the stillness hit me. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles when a house has been holding its breath too long. The air smelled stale, a little dusty, and faintly metallic. The only sound came from a TV murmuring somewhere in the back rooms. We followed the noise to a bedroom. The man sat on the floor with his back against the bed frame. His legs stretched in front of him, feet angled outward like he had eased himself down and never stood back up. His eyes were open. His breathing was shallow and uneven, but he was alive. I knelt beside him and said my name. His gaze shifted slightly, not quite toward me but close enough that I knew he heard. His lips moved, but all that came out was a dry rasp. His skin felt cold through my gloves. A faint tremor pulsed through his fingers. It looked like he had been like this for hours. I asked him if he could squeeze my hand. He tried, but the movement was barely there. My partner checked the rest of the room while I lifted his head to clear his airway. He kept lifting one hand, almost pointing behind us toward the doorway. I turned each time, but there was nothing there except the wall and the quiet hallway. We prepared to move him. The process felt slow even though we worked quickly. His vitals were all over the place. Blood pressure dangerously low, heart rate fading and then stubbornly rising again. He looked at me with a kind of tired fear I cannot describe. Not panic. More like resignation mixed with confusion. Carrying him down the hall felt like walking through someone's unfinished story. The smell of the dusty carpet, the worn family photos on the wall, the chill in the air from a heater that must have turned off hours earlier. Everything in the house felt paused, waiting for an outcome it already understood. On the way to the hospital, his condition dropped fast. He lost consciousness, regained it for a few seconds, then slipped again. I kept telling him to stay with me, even though I was not sure he could hear. My partner monitored the rhythm while I pushed fluids, hoping to stabilize what looked more like a long decline than a sudden event. When we arrived, the hospital team took him from us and began working. The neighbor arrived a few minutes later, pale, shaking, trying to explain that she should have checked sooner. I wanted to tell her the outcome was not her fault, but the words never felt right leaving my mouth. Some moments do not accept reassurance. We stood in the doorway while the staff tried everything they could. After several minutes, a doctor stepped out, and I knew the answer from the way he stopped walking before he reached us. He explained softly, gently, the way doctors do when they know the news will hit like a stone. The neighbor pressed her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. Back at the house, I kept thinking about the TV that had been playing that morning show to an empty room. The laughter track echoing in that quiet space felt strangely cruel, like the world had kept moving while he sat alone waiting for someone to notice. That unwritten rule echoed in my head again: quiet scenes are never simple. They hold more weight, more silence, more unfinished words than the chaotic ones ever do. I still think about that house. The stillness. The way he tried to point at something none of us could see. and how some calls end without giving you a place to put the sadness you carry out the door.
I have been a paramedic for 7 years, and in that time I have seen how quickly a normal call can turn personal. It usually happens when you least expect it. That morning started quietly.
The sun was barely rising, turning the sky soft and grey.
I remember thinking it might be an easy shift. The rig smelled like fresh gloves, and the bitter coffee my partner had brewed too strong. We had just finished restocking when dispatch called out a priority for a teenage male with chest pain at a school field. That combination did not sit right with me. Teenagers get injured, sure, but chest pain was different. When we arrived, the coach waved us over from the middle of the field. His face was tight, the way people look when they are trying to stay calm in front of a team of kids. The boy sat on the grass with his elbows on his knees, breath short and shallow. His teammates stood in a loose circle, pretending not to stare. The morning air carried the smell of damp grass and the faint rubber scent from the track. I knelt in front of him and introduced myself. He tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth shook. He kept apologizing for stopping practice. His pulse was fast, too fast for his age. His skin was pale except for a flush along his neck that told me his heart was working overtime. He insisted he just needed a minute to catch his breath. I told him we were going to check everything anyway. We helped him to the ambulance. The coach followed a few steps behind, looking more scared than he wanted anyone to notice. Inside the rig, the boy tried to sit up straight like he wanted to prove he was fine. When I placed the monitor leads on his chest, he whispered that he didn't want his mom to worry. That hit me harder than I expected. I told him we were taking him to the hospital so she could meet us there. His EKG looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong in the way that signals danger if you know what to look for. I kept my voice steady. My partner handled the radio, updating the hospital.
The boy's breathing grew une veine.
He clenched his fists when the ambulance took a sharp turn, like he was holding onto consciousness itself. Halfway there he asked if he would still get to play in his next game. His voice cracked in the middle of the question. I told him that the doctors would figure everything out, which was the closest thing to honesty I could offer. He nodded, but his eyes filled with that quiet fear you only see in people who understand something is happening inside them that they cannot describe. Then the shift came. His hand twitched, his head sagged, and his breathing flattened into a thin whisper of air. The monitor lit up with an irregular rhythm. I called his name. He tried to respond, but nothing came. I pushed meds, adjusted oxygen, coached him to stay with me even though his gaze was drifting like he was slipping underwater. My partner prepared equipment faster than I could ask for it. By the time we reached the hospital, the boy was barely conscious. The staff opened the doors before we even stopped rolling. The hallway filled with urgent voices. They moved around him in a blur. His mother arrived moments later. She was out of breath, hair tangled, still wearing pajamas under her coat. She asked if she could see him. I told her yes and stepped aside. Paramedics always step aside when the family shows up. From the hallway, I watched her hold his hand. She kept telling him she was there, that he was safe, that he just needed to hang on. I turned away because it felt like stealing a moment that wasn't mine. A doctor walked by and told us quietly that it looked like an undiagnosed heart condition. They were still working on him. He didn't say anything about the odds, and he didn't need to. I had seen enough to read the gaps in his words. We finished our report in the ambulance. My partner tried to talk about something normal, but the conversation died in the middle. Some calls leave too much behind for small talk. I stared at the empty stretcher, replaying the way the boy asked about his next game as if the future still felt close to him. Later, when we checked back, a nurse confirmed what I already suspected. Things were not improving. She said they would keep trying, but her eyes told the truth first. I thanked her, even though the words felt thin. That call stayed with me long after the shift ended. Not because it was dramatic, but because it involved someone who still believed everything ahead of him was guaranteed. Some days this job teaches you how fragile those guarantees really are. And some days it reminds you that not every story we carry reaches a finish line we can accept.
I have been a paramedic long enough to know when a shift is carrying the wrong kind of silence. It was one of those nights. The air felt colder than it should have for late spring, and the wind kept brushing loose leaves across the station lot. My partner joked that the weather always acted strange before we got a difficult call. I laughed, but only because she expected me to. Something in my gut already knew the night had teeth.
The call came just after midnight. Unknown medical. Caller disconnected.
That is never a good sign. We pulled onto a narrow street where most houses were dark. One porch light flickered like it could not make up its mind. A man met us outside, waving with jerky movements that hinted at panic. He said he found his roommate collapsed in the hallway but didn't know how long he had been down. When we stepped into the house, the air felt thick and warm, like the heater had been running non-stop. The living room lights were on, but the hallway where the patient lay was dim. I could see his legs first, then the rest of him as I crouched down. He was in his 30s. No visible injuries. Just a stillness that didn't fit a living body.
I tapped his shoulder. No response.
His skin was clammy, and his pulse fluttered weakly under my fingers. His breathing came in shallow bursts, like his body had forgotten how to take full air. My partner began prepping equipment while I checked his airway and tried to get a better read on his condition. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The roommate kept pacing behind us, asking if his friend was going to be okay. Each time he asked, he sounded less convinced by his own question. I tried to reassure him without making promises. I have learned the hard way not to offer certainty when all you have is guesswork. We lifted the patient onto the stretcher. His head lolled to the side, and for a moment it looked like he was about to wake, but then his body went limp again. The house smelled like old carpet and something faintly metallic. I couldn't tell if it was from the heater or something related to the patient's condition. Inside the ambulance, his vitals dipped further.
Heart rate unstable. Oxygen saturation falling.
His breathing stretched into long pauses that made the seconds feel slow. I called out numbers while my partner adjusted oxygen and prepared meds. The man's eyes flickered open once, unfocused, drifting past me like he was looking into a room I couldn't see. Halfway to the hospital, he exhaled sharply, and then nothing followed. I called his name, hoping he would react to the sound.
He didn't.
We began interventions immediately. The ambulance lights flashed in the windows of passing buildings. Everything outside looked distorted, as if the world was bending with each bump in the road. We regained a faint rhythm, but it felt borrowed, like a temporary guest in a failing system. My partner radioed the hospital, giving them a heads up that our patient was crashing. I kept monitoring him, hoping for any sign of improvement.
None came.
At the ER doors, the staff rushed him inside. They moved quickly, surrounding him with equipment and clipped voices. The roommate arrived minutes later, out of breath and shaking. He asked if we thought his friend would pull through. I told him the doctors were doing everything they could. It was the truth, but not the answer he wanted. A nurse came out after a while, hands clasped, expression serious. She said they were still working. That phrase always means the same thing. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped back. My partner leaned against the wall, rubbing her eyes, waiting for the final word we already knew was coming. We left before it arrived. On the ride back to the station, neither of us talked.
The quiet felt heavier than the night air outside the windows.
I kept thinking about the man lying in that dark hallway, the flickering porch light, the unsettled feeling I had before we even arrived. Some calls feel strange from the start. Not supernatural or dramatic, just wrong in a way you can't name. That shift reminded me that sometimes the signs are quiet.
A cold night. A disconnected call.
A patient whose eyes open for a second and look past you, not at you.
And when the night ends, you carry those seconds with you long after the sun comes up again.
I have worked as a paramedic for nearly a decade, and I can admit something I never said out loud in training. Sometimes the worst calls are the ones that start with a small mistake. Not a catastrophic one. Just a single detail you misread or a sign you brush off because the scene looks simple. You tell yourself you will fix it once you get more information. Most times you do. But I still remember the night when I didn't. The call came in as abdominal pain at a small rental house near the edge of town. It was the kind of call we get so often that the phrasing barely registers. My partner and I talked about dinner while we drove, both of us hungry, both of us expecting a standard transport. The radio stayed quiet. The sky hung low and overcast, giving the houses a washed-out look. Nothing felt urgent. When we entered the house, a young man in his 20s sat on the couch holding his stomach. He tried to downplay everything, saying he probably ate something bad. His skin looked pale, but not dramatically. He was sweating a little, but the heater was running high. I asked him the usual questions. When did the pain start? What had he eaten? Had he been nauseated? He answered calmly. Too calmly, in hindsight. He said the pain began in the afternoon and had been getting sharper. His roommate hovered behind us, worried but unsure if calling us had been overreacting. The room smelled faintly like leftover food and laundry detergent. Nothing about the scene screamed emergency. That was my first mistake, letting the calmness shape my expectations. I checked his vitals. Heart rate elevated, but not alarming. Blood pressure slightly low. He winced when I palpated his abdomen, but people do that even when it's nothing serious. He kept apologizing for making us come out at night. I told him it was fine, though something in the back of my mind felt unsettled. We helped him to the stretcher. He walked slowly, hunched, but still steady. I told myself he was stable enough for a routine ride. On the way to the ambulance, I noticed he paused and gripped the doorway for balance. His face tightened for a second, then relaxed. I registered it, but I didn't stop to reassess. Second mistake. Inside the rig, his condition shifted almost immediately. He lay back, closed his eyes, and said the pain was spreading across his entire abdomen. His breathing grew fast and shallow. I checked his vitals again. Heart rate climbing. Blood pressure dropping. A cold sheen formed along his forehead. My partner looked at me, and I saw worry replace the relaxed expression she had half an hour earlier. We began treating more aggressively. His abdomen felt rigid to the touch now, something that had not been clear at the house. He curled in on himself, groaning through clenched teeth. I asked about any injuries, any falls, anything he might have missed. He shook his head, eyes squeezed shut. Halfway to the hospital, he suddenly went quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the wrong way. His head slumped to the side, and his breaths became thin, almost silent. A deep instinct told me something big was happening internally, something that had been building long before we arrived. We radioed ahead, requesting immediate surgical evaluation. The ER staff took him the moment we arrived. They moved fast, but the urgency in their movements told me they suspected the same thing I did. A potential rupture. Internal bleeding. Something severe hidden under symptoms that had looked mild an hour earlier. His roommate arrived soon after, out of breath and scared. He asked if we thought the young man would be okay. I told him the doctors were working on it. It was the only answer I could give without lying. He nodded, but he didn't believe me. I didn't believe myself either. A nurse updated us 20 minutes later. They suspected a ruptured appendix with heavy internal infection, possibly complications that had gone unnoticed for days. They were preparing surgery, but the situation was unstable. That word always lands like a weight. We finished our report in the rig. The heater clicked softly above us. My partner didn't say much. I kept replaying the scene in the house. The calmness. The mild vitals. The moment he paused in the doorway. Each detail felt sharper now, like clues I should have read differently. Later, when we checked back, the nurse only had one sentence for us. He's not doing well. No details. No reassurance. Just that. Some calls you move past. Others linger, because you know you missed something small that mattered. I still think about that night. The ordinary living room. The quiet patient who didn't want to bother anyone. The signs that looked mild until they weren't. And how one simple assumption can follow you longer than any siren ever could.
I have been a paramedic for 8 years, and every so often a call reminds me that kindness shows up in strange places. It doesn't arrive with music or clean timing. Sometimes it appears in the middle of a scene that is falling apart, and you only recognize it later, when the shift has ended and you finally let yourself feel the weight of what happened. It was late afternoon when we got the call. Difficulty breathing. Elderly female. The address was an aging duplex near the edge of town, the kind where the yard is too small for anything except a cracked walkway and a single garden chair. When we parked, I saw a teenage boy waving from the door, shouting for us to hurry. His voice cracked between panic and determination, the way voices do when fear hits before the brain has time to catch up. Inside, the house was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon, like someone had tried to make it comforting. His grandmother sat on the sofa, leaning forward, both hands pressed to her chest. Her breath came in short, clipped bursts. I knelt beside her and introduced myself. She tried to answer, but the words dissolved into a weak cough that shook her entire frame. The boy stepped back and apologized over and over for not calling sooner. He said she didn't want him to worry, that she insisted it was just a cold. I told him he did the right thing. He stood there twisting the hem of his hoodie, trying to hold himself together. Her pulse was rapid. Oxygen levels low. Lips tinged with blue. I could hear crackling sounds in her lungs as she struggled to draw air. I kept my voice calm, asking her simple questions, giving her time to respond. She squeezed my hand lightly, as if trying to assure me she understood even when she couldn't speak. We prepared to move her to the stretcher. The boy insisted on carrying the oxygen bag. He said he wanted to help. I let him. People need something to hold when the world around them is slipping. She looked at him with a small smile, the kind that tries to hide pain. That was the moment I knew this call would stay with me no matter how it ended. Inside the ambulance, her breathing worsened. Each inhale sounded like she was climbing a steep hill. I increased oxygen, checked her vitals again, and tried to keep her focused on my voice. She whispered to me that she was worried about her grandson, not herself. She said he had already lost too much in his life. I didn't press for details. Sometimes you can hear the history in the tone alone. Halfway to the hospital, things took a hard turn. Her breaths became shorter, her eyes drifting in and out of focus. She squeezed my hand again, this time with more urgency. I told her to stay with me. She tried. I could see the effort in every muscle of her face. Her heart rhythm started to falter. I called out the numbers to my partner, who radioed ahead. We pushed meds, tried positioning changes, anything that might buy a little more time. She looked at me once, really looked at me, and whispered something I didn't catch. Then her gaze slipped away. When we reached the ER, the staff took over immediately. They moved quickly, surrounding her with equipment and clipped instructions. The boy stood by the wall, shaking, his hands still gripping the oxygen bag he had insisted on carrying. I went to him and told him he did everything he could. He nodded without meeting my eyes. Sometimes people avoid looking at you because they fear the truth you're holding. A nurse came out 20 minutes later. Her expression said everything before she did. She spoke softly, telling us they were still working, but it was unlikely they could reverse the damage. The boy pressed both hands to his face. His shoulders sank. I placed a hand on his back, not sure if it helped. When we returned to the rig, I sat for a moment before writing the report. The cinnamon scent still clung to my uniform. I kept thinking about the way she held my hand, not out of fear, but out of concern for someone else. Even in her worst moment, she was thinking about him. Some calls show you the hardest parts of this job. Others show you something gentler hidden inside the hard parts. That afternoon, kindness came from a grandmother who could barely breathe and a teenager who refused to let go of an oxygen bag because it made him feel like he was part of saving her. But the truth is, some kindnesses don't get a happy ending. And sometimes that's what hurts the most.
I have been a paramedic for 11 years, and every station collects rumors. They spread during downtime, whispered over stale coffee or while restocking the rig. Most are harmless. Some are funny. But every now and then a rumor sticks because it carries a little truth inside it. At our station, the story was about a certain apartment complex on Hoover Street. The rumor was simple: calls from that building never ended the way you hoped. People joked about it, but behind the laughter there was always a pause, like everyone had a memory they wished they could forget. My encounter with that place happened on a cold evening. The sun had already dropped, leaving the sky the color of steel. My partner and I were eating in the rig, parked near a quiet street, when dispatch sent us the address. The moment she heard it, she exhaled sharply. "Hoover again," she muttered. I tried to shrug it off, but even I felt the shift in my stomach. The building was old, with balconies leaning slightly forward as if they were tired of holding themselves up. A thin strip of yellow hallway light spilled into the cold air. A neighbor met us near the entrance, pointing nervously toward the third floor. "He hasn't come out all day," she said. "Something's wrong." I knocked and he didn't answer. We climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the concrete shaft. When we reached the door, I knocked hard and announced us. No response. The neighbor gave us the spare key. The moment I opened the door, stale air rolled out, thick enough to make me hesitate. Not the scent of death. Something different. Like the room had been closed too long. Inside, a man in his late 50s sat slumped against the wall near the kitchen. His legs were stretched out, one shoe missing, his head tilted back. A plate of food lay spilled beside him. I spoke his name, but he didn't react. When I checked for a pulse, I found a faint flutter, so faint I had to double-check. His breathing barely moved his chest. My partner started oxygen while I checked his abdomen and chest. Nothing obvious. No trauma. The place was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint vibration of pipes in the walls. The man's skin was cool, and his eyelids twitched slightly when I spoke to him, but he could not answer. His breathing made a soft whistling sound that worried me more than anything else. We lifted him onto the stretcher. The hallway felt too narrow as we maneuvered him through it. The neighbor watched from a distance, hands clasped, whispering that he had always kept to himself. She said she felt guilty for not checking sooner. I told her she did the right thing by calling. People say that a lot, but sometimes it's the only comfort you can offer. Inside the ambulance, his condition unraveled fast. His heart rate slid down, each drop sharper than the last. I placed the monitor leads, and the rhythm showed a dangerous pattern I didn't like. He grimaced once, a small flicker of pain across his face, and then his body relaxed too much. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of stillness you recognize immediately after seeing it enough times. My partner called out our ETA to the hospital while I pushed fluids and checked his airway. His breaths became shallow, spaced apart like his body was forgetting the pattern. I called his name louder. Sometimes patients respond to the sound even when they're barely conscious, but this time there was nothing. We arrived at the ER, and the staff rushed him inside. They moved him to a trauma room, voices tight, movements quick. A doctor gave us a short nod, the universal sign meaning stand by, but stay back. I cleaned my gloves slowly, watching through the glass window as the team surrounded him. A few minutes later, the doctor stepped out. His expression said everything before he spoke. "Severe internal infection," he explained. "Likely progressing for days." He didn't add the rest, but I knew what it meant. Even with everything they were doing, the odds were almost non-existent. We walked back to the ambulance. The cold air hit harder than before. My partner leaned on the door, shaking her head. "Hoover," she said quietly. "It gets everyone eventually." I didn't respond. I just sat inside the rig, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Rumors in this job aren't usually about ghosts or curses. They're about patterns we don't want to admit we've noticed. That building on Hoover Street wasn't haunted. It was forgotten. People slipped through the cracks there, and by the time someone reached out for help, it was often too late. I still think about that call when I pass the building on my way to another run. The lights in the windows look the same as any other place. But I understand why the rumor exists. Some addresses carry a history you can't shake. And some calls remind you that no matter how hard you try, you won't always get there in time. I have been a paramedic for almost 9 years, and somewhere along the way I stopped noticing the exact moment I began to burn out. It wasn't dramatic. No breakdown. No big failure. Just small pieces of myself wearing thin one shift after another. For a long time I told myself I was fine. You do that in this job. You convince yourself the weight isn't heavy if you carry it fast enough. The call that marked my turning point came late in the evening, during a stretch of shifts that had already blurred together. Unconscious juvenile. Breathing unknown. Those 4 words tightened something in my chest. Kids are always harder. The tone of the dispatcher's voice told me this one wasn't minor. We arrived at a small house with peeling paint and toys scattered across the porch. A woman met us outside, frantic, crying so hard she could barely speak. She pointed toward the living room, unable to form words. Every instinct in me braced before I stepped inside. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, lay on the floor near a tipped-over bookshelf. A lamp was broken beside her. The house smelled like dinner that had burned on the stove and fear that had been running wild for several minutes. I knelt down and checked her airway. Her breathing was shallow, too shallow, like a candle flickering in a draft. Her pulse was rapid and weak. Her skin felt cool. I asked the mother what happened, but she kept repeating that she only left the room for a minute. My partner comforted her while I started assessing everything I could. There was no obvious trauma beyond a bruise forming near the girl's temple. I tried talking to her, hoping for any reaction. Nothing. We lifted her gently to the stretcher. The mother gripped my arm and begged me not to let her daughter die. I told her we were doing everything we could. It was the truth, but it felt hollow the moment it left my mouth. There is no sentence that can hold back panic in a moment like that. Inside the ambulance, I worked fast: oxygen, airway support, vitals, glucose. Her numbers didn't make sense at first. They jumped, then dipped, then jumped again. She winced once when I adjusted her head, but then she slipped deeper, her breaths fading into tiny shallow movements. I kept my voice steady, telling her to stay with me, telling her she was safe, even though I wasn't sure she could hear any of it. Halfway to the hospital, her rhythm changed. Slow. Irregular. Wrong. I felt my heart drop in the same quiet way it has on too many calls. My partner drove faster. I pushed meds, monitored her airway, tried to keep her remaining breath steady. My hands moved automatically, but inside I felt something tightening, like a knot I could not loosen. We pulled into the ER bay and rushed her inside. The staff moved quickly, surrounding her in a blur of equipment and clipped commands. The mother arrived behind us, sobbing so hard she could barely walk straight. She reached for her daughter, but a nurse gently held her back. The woman's knees buckled. My partner caught her before she hit the floor. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I should have, watching through the glass as the team worked. Then I forced myself to step away. You learn to do that in this job, step away before the weight crushes you, but that night it felt different, like I was leaving more of myself behind than usual. 20 minutes later, a doctor came out. His expression had the same controlled sadness I had seen 100 times. He spoke softly, gently, but I already knew. The mother let out a sound I will never forget, a raw, breaking sound that went straight through me. My partner and I walked back to the rig. She tried to say something comforting, then gave up. There are moments when no words fit. I sat in the passenger seat, staring at my hands, noticing they were shaking for the first time in months. Maybe for the first time all year. On the drive back, the radio dispatched another call, but my mind stayed in that living room with the broken lamp and the little girl who didn't open her eyes. I kept seeing her mother's face, the way her hope shattered all at once. People think burnout looks like exhaustion or anger. Sometimes it looks like silence. A long, heavy silence that follows you from call to call until you realize you've lost the part of yourself that used to bounce back. That night didn't break me, but it showed me how close I was. It made me understand that some calls don't stay at the hospital. They travel with you. They settle in your chest. And no matter how many shifts come after, they never completely leave.
I have been a paramedic for almost a decade, and I used to believe that perspective came from experience alone. The more calls you ran, the more you understood. The more scenes you walked into, the more patterns you recognized. But there was one call that changed that belief completely. Not because it was dramatic, but because it forced me to see something I had been ignoring for years.
It happened on a slow afternoon, the kind where the city feels heavy and tired.
The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything look washed out. My partner and I were stationed near a park, waiting for something to happen. When dispatch finally chimed in with a call, it sounded straightforward. Male, mid-60s. Chest discomfort. Caller reports he is alert. I remember thinking we'd probably transport, monitor the usual vitals, and move on. When we arrived, the patient was sitting on a bench near the edge of the park. Leaves piled around his shoes. He wore a faded jacket and held a small paper bag on his lap, gripping it with both hands like it was important. He was breathing fast, but he tried to smile when I introduced myself. He said he didn't want to ruin anyone's day. People say that more than you'd expect. His face looked pale. Sweat lined his hairline. His pulse felt irregular, skipping beats like a scratched record. I asked how long he'd been feeling this way. He told me since morning, but he didn't want to make a fuss. He said he'd been thinking about calling earlier, but talked himself out of it. I felt a familiar frustration rise in my chest, but I kept my voice gentle. We helped him stand. He moved slowly, clutching the paper bag to his chest. When I tried to take it from him, he shook his head and told me it was too important. I decided not to push him. People hold on to things for reasons you don't always understand until later. Inside the ambulance, I placed the monitor leads on him. His heart rhythm confirmed what I feared: serious instability. He was slipping into something dangerous. I told him we were taking him straight to the hospital. He nodded, then whispered something I almost didn't hear. I didn't think anyone would care. I asked him what he meant. He said he lived alone, no family nearby, no one who checked in. The paper bag, he explained, held a few small belongings: photos, a letter, a watch. Things I didn't want thrown out, he said. That sentence hit harder than any medical detail. He thought he might not make it, and he packed his life into a paper bag so it wouldn't disappear unnoticed. Halfway to the hospital, his breathing changed. The rise and fall of his chest slowed. He gripped my wrist with surprising strength, then let go. His eyes drifted, unfocused. I called his name. He blinked, but the response was faint. The monitor alarms began their sharp rhythm, the sound that fills every inch of the ambulance no matter how you try to tune it out. We worked fast. Oxygen. Meds.
Repositioning.
My partner pushed the speed as much as she could. I kept talking to him, telling him to stay with me, telling him we were close. His breaths became shallower, spaced out like his body couldn't remember the pattern anymore. His fingers loosened on the paper bag. I caught it before it fell. When we reached the ER, the staff took him immediately. I placed the bag on the counter near the trauma room. It looked small, almost fragile. A few minutes later, a doctor came out with the expression I knew too well. He said they were still trying, but the damage was extensive, and the odds were low. He didn't need to say more. I stood there staring at the bag.
The watch inside.
The letter. The photos. All the pieces of a life reduced to the weight of something that could be held in one hand. I wondered how long he had been carrying the fear that no one would notice if he didn't survive the day. We left before the final update. The shift continued. Calls kept coming. But my mind stayed with him. I couldn't shake the way he held that paper bag like it anchored him to the world. That call changed my perspective more than any dramatic rescue or high-stress scene. It made me see how many people move through the city quietly, carrying their entire story alone, hoping someone will care when it matters. And the hardest part is knowing that sometimes, even when we show up, it is already too late.